Hello and welcome to this episode of Standard Deviation, my column and video series. I'm TCA Sharad Raghavan, and today I'm going to be speaking to you about my column on how the Modi government is missing out on making history by going slow on one of its biggest reforms, the public sector enterprises policy, or in other words, its disinvestment policy. One of the biggest reforms announced by the Modi government, the privatization of public sector companies, seems to be dying a slow death brought on by utter policy confusion. What else can one call it when the government sets ambitious disinvestment targets year after year, but then conducts fewer rounds of disinvestments each year? Or what can you call it when the government's policy includes the shutting down of public sector companies, but more than 1/3 of the current central public sector enterprises remain active on paper yet are classified as not operational? But first, a short recap of what the PSE policy is. The Modi government used the Atmanirbhar Bharat package of May 2020 to announce a number of sectoral reforms, one of which was the Public Sector Enterprises Policy, or the PSE policy. Under this policy, the government said that it would restrict itself to a minimum presence in key strategic sectors and would entirely exit the non-strategic ones. The exits were to take place through disinvestment and closures. Now, given the large number of companies across diverse sectors that the government has a presence in, it was expected that such a process would take time. You can't exit from multiple sectors of the economy overnight. Apart from the economic fallout, there are also the political implications. Privatization has always been a politically tricky thing to pull off. However, while nobody is calling for haste in the disinvestment process, although it might be good to see, there's no reason for the current level of seeming inaction. For example, in 2022-23, the government managed to reach just a little over half of its disinvestment target. In the current financial year, the government has managed to disinvest just about 12,500 crore out of an initial target of 61,000 crore. That target has now been revised to 30,000 crore, which is still pretty optimistic if you ask me. This is the first element of confusion evident in the government's disinvestment-related policy making. Perhaps for political reasons, the government can't be seen to be taking back its PSE policy, which would be seen as admitting defeat. Instead, what it seems to be doing is setting disinvestment targets for the year that would suggest it intends to plow ahead with the policy, but then actually go slow on doing anything about it. Why else would it set a target of 50,000 crore for FY25 when none of the trends show that it will come close to that number? Compounding the confusion are the repeated statements by the disinvestment secretary saying that the government is going to be relying as much on dividends as it is on proceeds from disinvestment. This seems to be confirmed by the numbers in the budget. In 2022-23, the government received nearly 1 lakh crore as dividends from public sector enterprises, the RBI, and public sector banks. In the current year, it budgeted to receive 91,000 crore, which it then revised upwards to 1.54 lakh crore. For the next financial year, that is 24-25, it started off with an assumption that it will get 1.5 lakh crore from dividends. A large part of this dividend income comes from the RBI, but the contributions of the public sector enterprises and banks are still significant. The confusion here comes from the fact that conventionally, the debate of disinvestments versus dividends is usually couched as a zero-sum game. That is, the thought is that the more disinvestment that is done, then fewer dividends will come in. And if more dividends are needed, then less disinvestment can be done. This would be the case if all public sector companies were profit-making and therefore capable of actually paying dividends. The unfortunate truth is that a large number of these companies are simply not operational, and of the ones that are operational, many are loss-making. Here's what the latest annual report of the Ministry of Finance has to show. Of the 389 central public sector enterprises as of March 2022, which is the latest period for which there is data, 141 or about 36% were not operational at all. Of the 248 that were still operational, 60 were loss-making. So, taken together, that means that more than half of the public sector enterprises were either not operational or were loss-making. Disinvestment and exit needs to start with these. The PSE policy is quite clear about the fact that exiting from non-strategic sectors would include the closure of several companies. There's very little justification for having 141 non-operational companies on the government's books. And if those 60 loss-making companies can't be turned around, then they too should be shut down. What this shutting down involves is something worth exploring. If it's just a matter of paperwork, then that should be fast-tracked. Even if no money is earned from shutting these companies down, at least they'll no longer even be an accounting entry for the government. What the government will be left with is the profit-making companies, which can actually pay dividends, and at the same time, it would have substantially reduced its presence in a number of sectors, which is a stated aim of its PSE policy. One argument being made about why the government is going slow on disinvestment is that the RSS is not in favor of the policy. That's what a lot of people are saying. However, if we are to go by what the Swadeshi Jagran Manch, which is the economic policy arm of the RSS, has to say, then this is not true. As Ashwani Mahajan, the national co-convener of the SJM, said in a recent interview with ThePrint, the SJM is only against strategic disinvestment, which is where the government's stake is sold to a single big buyer. The RSS and the SJM are in fact totally fine with the government selling its stake in the open market, with general investors picking up small pieces of government companies. This way, the government earns money from disinvestment and the common citizenry becomes a stakeholder in public sector companies. The other major hurdle in the disinvestment process is the fact that many of these companies were set up in pre-independence time. And so a lot of the paperwork is in physical form, and unfortunately, a lot of it has been lost. For example, many companies have leased land from state governments, and now the lease papers are lost. So there's no way to dispose of that land. However, here too the government has a solution that could work. The details of the PSE policy say that land leased from states can be returned to the state government without insisting on any compensation. In other words, the land is to be returned, no questions asked. Whether this can work or not is something the administration at the center and the state have to figure out. My point is that complications arising out of paperwork can easily be dealt with should the will to do so exist. The Modi government has a number of policies that exist only on paper. Unfortunately, the PSE policy, which is one that could have really distinguished the Modi government from its predecessors, is quickly becoming another such example. On that note, that's all from me. Thank you so much for watching.